Checkout tracking by the NPD Group brings you a receipt collecting system that gathers data anonymously through technology we created, providing your businesses with answers.
Before I get going, if I go too fast and you want to find any of what we're going to talk about today, just go to the link there. You'll find pretty much everything that's there. So I'm Tim Merel from Digi-Capital. We advise mobile, AR, VR, games and digital companies in America, China, Japan, South Korea, and Europe. We do three basic things. Do investment banking, so buying and selling companies. We do management consulting, which is mainly strategy work, either for companies growing very quickly that want to grow faster, or for very large companies that say want to go from being a mobile company in China and move into AR and VR in the States or Europe. And the last piece we do is industry analysis, and that's what we're going to go through some of now. So to state the obvious, AR and VR are really exciting markets. It's very early stage. You've got a range of companies on, say, the AR side. There's ODG, Magic Leap, Microsoft with HoloLens, Meta, Apple bought Mateo recently, and many others. And then as we move across into VR, you've got Facebook with Oculus, HTC Vive, Sony with Morpheus, moving on to Razer with OSVR, Samsung with the Gear VR, Google Cardboard, and all the related solutions. So it's, for a market that hasn't really launched yet, it's already pretty busy in terms of hardware platforms. And when it comes to the hardware, what we're seeing already is a fairly strong divergence of technology. You know, you look at as many of these headsets as are on the screen, and you'll see different approaches to everything from the way the images are presented to your eyes, to controllers, and so on. So it's a fascinating early stage market. Now, AR and VR, on the face of them, are very similar things. They've both got stereo vision, stereo audio, head tracking, and so on. But they're fundamentally different. VR takes the user and puts them inside, places them inside a virtual world, so immersing them. AR places virtual things into the user's real world, augmenting it. Now, that might sound like splitting hairs, but there's a huge difference, and it could enable AR to not just end up passing VR in the long term, but also end up disrupting the smartphone and tablet market. So where can you use AR and VR? VR is best used in controlled environments, so at home, in your office, in a train, on a plane, basically anywhere where you're not going to be hit by a truck because you haven't got peripheral vision. You can't really walk down the street wearing a VR headset because you're going to bump into things. AR, very different, because you can see around it and through it anywhere you can walk, jump, run, climb, drive. Even there are some experiments being done with NASA, with ODG and Microsoft, actually on the International Space Station. You can use AR pretty much anywhere. And so that flexibility, that more broad applicability, gives it a much greater potential in the long run. So when we look at the markets that AR and VR are going to cannibalize and grow, VR is going to cannibalize and grow the markets that most folks in this room are very familiar with, the console and PC games market, the 3D film markets, and then niche enterprise users. And we'll come back to the enterprise users in a second. So we're talking about markets that will end up with tens of millions of users. So deep niche markets, large numbers of users, great places to operate, particularly for games. When we then look at the AR market, you're talking about it cannibalizing and growing smartphones and tablets. So ending up with an installed base in the hundreds of millions of users. So a very different set of use cases, a very different scale of market. Again, VR is a fantastic place to be, particularly for games, but for a broader set of applications, AR, in the long run, will end up being a much larger platform. So let's look at those use cases and get a feel for actually what are the accessible markets. And in particular, we'll focus in on the games market for the folks in this room. Now, VR, if you look at, say, what the image at the top left is from Tommy Palm's resolution games. Tommy created Candy Crush. And I was chatting with him and some of his guys about this in the last couple of weeks. That's going to be far and away for games developers the largest market. The VR games market is going to be the place to be if you're interested in VR as a games developer. Then you move on to 3D films, so things like Gravity and so on, and then the niche enterprise users of military, medical, and education. If you then look across to AR, it's much more of a general computing device. So it'll be used for commerce, basically Alibaba and Amazon selling things to folks in entirely new ways. making phone calls, browsing the web, so a lot of revenue coming into the telcos. And then looking at Hollywood, looking at streaming video, and we think there'll be a lot more streaming of standard 2D content from the TV stations and the film companies, less 3D, which we expect to be more in VR. And then the enterprise users across all the different slices, whether it be finance or construction or any of the other verticals within enterprise. Then when you start to get to a much larger market, looking from 2018 going forward, and you're getting into the hundreds of millions of users, that's when we anticipate the big brands coming in and starting to advertise. Then you move on to all of the consumer apps, from Facebook to Uber to Clash of Clans, and then on into games. And lastly, into theme parks, where actually it's already being experimented with at the moment. So how to think about the market? There are lots and lots of different technologies. Everybody talks about it differently. In terms of the reality matrix, the way we think about this is fairly simple. We look first at virtual versus augmented, which is relatively clear, but then we divide it into immersive and ambient. I'll explain what I mean by those. Immersive is where all the different aspects of the technology effectively trick your brain and your eyes and all the other senses into thinking what you're seeing is real. So when a virtual whale swims at you underwater, you jump out of the way. It's a sort of thing where, if you can remember when you were 8 years old and you'd been to the beach and you had an ice cream and you were full of sugar and you were feeling absolutely amazing, it's a sort of experience where when you're doing it, it feels that way. And when you've stopped doing it, you want to go back in. That's what we mean by immersive. Ambient experiences are ones where they are not necessarily as perfect as the immersive experiences, whether it be the positional tracking, the audio, the input, the resolution, whatever it might be. They're still great experiences in VR and AR, but not necessarily as strong on some of the specific technical drivers as immersive. And so that breaks the market down into virtual reality, where you see the Samsung Gear VR, Google Cardboard and all the related solutions. And then going up into immersive VR, it's where you get to Fove with their eye tracking, or Sony with Morpheus, and then Oculus and HTC Vive, which in terms of the really heavyweight VR players in the immersive space today, have some of the best experiences. Looking at the augmented side, then you look at augmented reality, where in many cases actually having an ambient experience is much better for specific use cases than having a fully immersive one. You know, if you've got a heads-up display and you're driving, you want to be able to distinguish between what's real in the real world and what you're seeing on the display very clearly, because you don't want to smash into a wall. Then when you look at mixed reality, you're looking at things like what ODG is providing, where you can switch between augmented and virtual reality by clipping in a lens in 15 seconds. And then moving up into what Microsoft's doing with HoloLens and Magic Leap are doing, where they can present a virtual object to you in the real world that looks solid, that stays where it is, that it's quite hard to distinguish between it being real and not. Now, even if it's in a cartoony fashion, it still tricks the brain into it there being a real object there, and you react as though it was. Let's talk about the technology a little bit. And we did a deep dive on the hardware in our augmented and virtual reality report for this last quarter. And we broke it down to 25 individual hardware and business components that you've got to get right to take the market from being an early adopter market, which it will be next year, to being a mass consumer market as we move to 2018 and into 2020. You can group them up into 7 broad groupings of things you need to be able to do. The first is mobility. Now, if AR and mixed reality are going to end up replacing the smartphone in your pocket, you have to be able to make phone calls. You have to be able to browse the web without being within Wi-Fi access. You know, without that, they're not going to replace a smartphone. You need 2 devices, and that will restrict the scale of the market. For VR, mobility is less of an issue, because in general, you're going to be using it when you're sitting down or standing up in a controlled environment. Then we move across into vision, and there are a whole range of very hard technical problems which are being solved here, whether it be resolution, because folks are already used to having retina displays on their smartphones and tablets, so you have to have that quality of resolution. Whether it be depth of field, depth of focus, field of view, there are a whole range of technical issues that are being solved in many different ways. And we're seeing everything from solutions where you've got a screen which you're looking at, to a waveguide where there's some very clever optics where light's being shined at a piece of glass that reflects back into your eye, all the way through to digital light field solutions where you're having multiple light fields actually projected onto your eye to really trick your eye into seeing thinking it's seeing what's actually there. Then we move onto immersion, and there are a whole range of technical challenges here. This is really where, again, your brain's tricked into making you react to what you're seeing as though it was real. It's things like the positional tracking. You know, there's the rotation, but also as you move through space, are things basically moving or staying where they should? There's jitter and judder. You know, is there a smooth scrolling of the image? There's object stability. You know, when you put something down on that wall over there, when I shoot paint at somebody in the audience, does it stay on them where I expect it to? That sort of thing. And then the audio aspects. Now, for game developers, audio is incredibly important when we're thinking about VR and AR, because you're in an immersive medium where the user, where the player, can look anywhere, and you can guide them by the sounds you use. You can build actually into the games what you're doing by actually using sound, particularly in terms of fully spatial 360-degree audio, not just stereo. Then we move on into usability, and basically the starting point here is you have to be able to do what you can already do with existing platforms. If you can't, well then why is somebody going to bother to spend the time and money to actually move on to a new platform? So that's things like the interfaces, and there are as many different ways of actually having user interface as there are platforms. There's eye tracking, there's positional tracking with the head, there's spatial stuff as you move around, there's voice recognition, there's hand and body tracking with folks like Leap Motion. And then you move on into the controllers, whether they be ring controllers, whether they be treadmills, whether they be touchpads, and there's a whole range of different input devices. And our broad view is we don't think any one input device is going to win out. We think it will be a blend of different input devices for different applications. Then you move on to the flexibility piece, and that's where you need to have cross-platform SDKs, so it's easy for folks to develop for any of these platforms. It's where you need to be able to flip between AR and VR seamlessly. And as I mentioned, there are already some solutions that can do that, but there are issues there that you've got to be mindful of. If you're driving down the street in your car and you're using it as AR and suddenly it flips into VR without you realizing it, well, you're going to hit something. So there are lots of technical issues to make sure the safety aspect is covered. And then we move on into wearability, and there are some significant factors, probably more significant for AR than they are for VR. With VR, it's got to be light enough weight, it's got to be comfortable, you need to be able to use it for half an hour at a stretch, and have it be a comfortable thing to do. For AR, it's very different. If you think about when you take a smartphone out of your pocket, it's a relatively personal decision as to which one you picked, and some people care about, does it look nice? Do you have an iPhone? Do you have a Samsung phone? Do you have a Xiaomi phone? What you have. When you put something on your face, it's a lot more personal. So actually, hands up, how many folks in the room wear reading glasses? Okay, now, how many of you tried more than 5 pairs before you actually settle on the ones you currently use? Okay, there you go. Now, that's reading glasses. This isn't something which potentially films people, that you're going to be wearing all day to take in information, so it's a very personal decision. That means it's got to be lightweight, it has to be stylish, it's got to be able to do what you want, but without getting in the way too much. Nobody wants to look like a cyborg walking down the street. So, when you think about the wearability issues and come back to flexibility, usability, and some of the other aspects, for AR in particular, you've got to have battery life that lasts for a long time. Now, having spoken to a bunch of the chip manufacturers, you would have seen, say, what Qualcomm announced with their processors in the last day or so. They're upping their game in terms of what they can do with the chips that go into these things to enable the weight to be lighter, battery life to be longer. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to wear an AR pair of glasses for most of the day, the same way you have the smartphone in your pocket. Now, the last thing, and probably the elephant in the room here, is affordability. There are 2 aspects. For VR, the important thing is the host platform. In other words, if you want to be able to use Oculus or the HTC Vive, you've got to have a top-end PC. So your overall system cost might be $1,500. Now, for early adopters, for folks who are core gamers, that shouldn't be a problem because they're used to paying for their fun and they'll pay what it takes. But to go to the mass consumer market, VR has to follow the well-proven path that consoles and PCs have followed in terms of bringing overall system prices down. Otherwise, it becomes much more challenging to go to a mass consumer. For AR, prices need to come down to being similar to smartphones. In other words, in the $600 to $1,000 range overall. And the other thing they need to be able to do is to be cross-subsidized by the telcos. Until, and again, if you've seen what Verizon's doing with its plans, because of how ubiquitous smartphones are, that's already going away for the smartphone market. For this market, particularly as it ramps up in the tens and eventually hundreds of millions, it needs to be able to make phone calls, it needs to be able to browse the web, so that the telcos can make data and voice revenues from it. So let's talk about the money side of things and what's going to happen in the next few years. And these are our forecasts going forward. The easy way of thinking about what sits under all of this is when you come back to installed base. VR is going to have an installed base in the tens of millions of units, AR in the hundreds of millions of units when it gets to scale. And so in the early market, next year when the market launches into 2017, VR will far away be the leader in terms of installed base and in terms of revenue. But as you move into 2018, when the technology gets to the stage where you can actually produce a really proper mass consumer set of glasses, then you're going to start to see AR take off. And we anticipate that by 2020, it will have around 80% of the market, so being a much larger platform. Now, that's all fine and good in terms of hardware manufacturers, but as games developers, you guys need to know where to spend your time, focus, and money. So let's look at where the money is going to come from. I'll start with VR, which for games is the more important of the two markets. Looking at VR, large market, it's going to be a substantial market and very meaningful for games. The largest part of that we anticipate will be, for VR, will be the games market. So if you're a games developer and you're thinking about AR versus VR, right now, we'd suggest that you focus very heavily on VR. It's going to be where the bulk of the money is. Then you move on into the hardware piece, film, and theme parks, and the niche markets, the enterprise and industrial markets. But those markets we expect to go much more towards AR. So I'll move across to the AR market. By 2020, we anticipate it will be by far the larger of the two markets. The largest piece will be hardware. Basically, if you're getting into hundreds of millions of units, that's going to generate a lot of revenue. And we actually anticipate the next Apple, or if Apple doesn't get there first, from the hardware perspective, will come out of this market. It's the next big technology market. Then e-commerce. So again, Alibaba, Amazon, Wanda e-commerce in China, selling to folks in totally new ways. Then we move on into the telco revenues of AR data and AR voice. And already we've had discussions with a few of the telcos about this, and they know it's coming. It's just a question of timing. Then move on into Hollywood, and again, we've spoken with most of the major blockbuster studios in the last 3 to 6 months. Every single studio is very, very strongly focused on how they can make this market work. Now, initially, they're approaching it from a marketing perspective because the revenues in the market with a relatively small installed base aren't big enough to justify them doing a full feature. It wouldn't make sense. But going forward, we've seen some where they're bringing in the blockbuster directors, where they've got an AR and VR lab, they've got every bit of kit that's on the market today, and they're coming in and they're thinking about, okay, how do I tell a story in a non-linear medium where right now I can decide what the camera spots are where people look around, but they can look around. I can't tell them where to look. Very different storytelling medium. So we're anticipating there being short-form content before we get long-form content. Then we move into enterprise, and there's a whole range of different solutions. You look at, say, what Daiquiri is doing in terms of aiming at folks on oil rigs, or aiming at people who are doing repairs elsewhere, as well as project management. Again, if you look at what HoloLens has been doing with Trimble in relation to construction, a whole range of uses there. Then we move on into the more consumer areas of ad spend, again, as you're getting up to scale. Then into the consumer apps, Facebook, Uber, and so on. And then into the games piece. So we anticipate the games will be a significant market for AR, but nowhere near the scale of the games market for VR. So again, as a games developer, VR is the market that we would suggest you focus on more heavily now. And then as the AR market grows up, then look at transferring those skills across one to the other. And then lastly on into the theme park piece, which again is going to be significant, but for you guys is probably not as relevant. So that's basically it for me in terms of the talk bit. You've been a very, very attentive audience, thank you. And if you've got any questions, happy to answer them. Thank you. Down here on the left.
Yes, price point is, when do you think the hardware companies are going to get there? How does that get over the hump?
Yeah, I think you need to think of this in stages. You can't think of it as being sort of one blast. If you think of VR as the gateway drug to AR in terms of the market, you need the equivalent for VR. Now, right now, if you look at what Facebook's doing with Oculus, or what HTC's doing, they're relatively expensive solutions. They're fantastic solutions. I mean, if you've had a chance to play with them, they're wonderful things to play with. They really are. But they're not cheap. So it's the early adopter market. People will pay for it. I was having a chat with Robert Scoble about this a few weeks back, and he was saying, I don't care what these things cost. I've played them. I want to have them. I'm going to buy them on day one. So that market's good. We've already started doing some thinking around folks like, say, Nintendo and what they could do, or somebody else could do, with a more of a blue ocean approach to the way that you think about the games market. So one of the solutions we've been thinking about is to be able to bring the overall system cost down, because you have to think about overall system cost, VR needs to be social as well as being fun. So how do you bring down system cost? There's already a lot of activity happening around mobile VR. So the holders for it, the Gear VR, cardboards, there's been some companies in China giving away the cardboard copies for free, very cheap. If you had a central console that was actually not necessarily as high fidelity as what Sony and Microsoft offer, that was doing all the coordination, the positional tracking to make immersion work, and then you used smartphone holders for the headsets, you could get the total system cost for, say, a 4-player social VR and with pass-through video AR system below $300. That's the sort of system which we think is going to be needed to take VR mass. When that goes mass, that takes the high-end VR stuff more mass, and that leads into AR. So it's that sort of continuum from something that's going to really have that blue ocean big bang effect at the consumer level is what's needed to take this from an early adopter market to a mass market. So the easy way of thinking about it, to give you the short answer you were asking originally, is it's 300 or less. It's getting to what you would pay for a low-end to mid-range console system. If you're aiming at folks who are playing games, and if you look at all the positioning of all of the VR companies at the moment in terms of the headsets, they're being positioned as games machines. That's the sort of market we're really talking about. Anybody else? Down the back.
Yes, I have a gaming background, but I've been working a lot in advertising, and there is an echo. Okay. And quick thing, from AR since 2009, people have been talking about it's going to explode, Great for professional application, but I haven't seen anything that in gaming, especially, that really makes sense, except the Kellogg's box, and you can do some stuff. And for VR, I'm actually a little bit concerned about gaming overall, because the type of gaming is very casual. Because if all of a sudden you start playing a first-person shooter, most of us will be throwing up. So I just wanted your reaction towards those statements.
I'll cover the AR question first and then move on to VR. AR, we don't think is going to be as big a market for games. And the reason is, if you want an immersive experience, well, that's VR. Done. However, if you look at what, say, Microsoft has shown with some of the demos for Minecraft, it shows what is possible. And if you look at, say, there's a company called Cast AR, who I recommend having a chat with. They're doing tabletop gaming for AR, and the stuff's really pretty good. But we still think that'll be a smaller part of the market. The overall applications for AR will be much broader, and because of the processing required and therefore the custom silicon needed, that's why we don't think it's going to really take off in a serious way until 2018. It'll take time. But let's move on to the VR question and the sort of gaming. And again, Tommy, actually, some of Tommy Palm's co-founders of Resolution Games are here at the conference. I think one's actually speaking now in one of the other rooms. One might have spoken yesterday. Carl Arvind, he's great. What they've found, and others have found, is that the more whimsical experiences, ones where they are lighter, some things which are more like, say, The Room, if you think about mobile games, more adventure puzzle games, are the ones, the lighter experience, the more whimsical experiences seem to lend themselves better to VR than things where you're moving your head around where you're going to get sick and throw up. There are clear guidelines from the VR headset manufacturers about, say, the pace with which, if you have somebody moving through space, the perception of speed, if you go beyond a certain speed, it's going to be a problem. So the nature of the game development will be different. It has to be different. And actually, I think in some ways it's quite a good thing, because if you think about the games, let's look at the mobile market, which is arguably the most important growth market for games. It's actually quite a dull market in terms of the different types of games that have been launched in the last 2 years. There haven't been that many radically new, different approaches to games in mobile for 2 years, I'd say. You look at how stable the top grossing charts are. It hasn't moved that much. VR is going to force game developers to think completely differently. And I'll give you one more. I know I'm talking about Resolution quite a bit, but I was chatting with them recently. They showed me their demo for their solitaire game, and I thought it was lovely. Very basic thing. You've got solitaire hanging in midair. You're in a library. There's a little character there, and you pick the cards by looking at them. You don't touch anything. There's no. So it's okay. I'm going to use my eyes as an input device. When have you ever seen that in a game? It's something you don't see much of. So if you think about the opportunity for game developers, the fact that VR requires you to do something different has the chance to completely reinvigorate the market from a game development point of view, because if you can't do something one way, you'll find another solution. If you find another solution, you may find a whole different genre of games. So I think your concerns are absolutely right about the motion sickness question, But I think actually the problems are why it's such an exciting market.
All right, Tim, I think we're out of time here, so we'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you.